Most people think food security means stockpiling cans, buying freeze dryers, or spending thousands on raised beds and fancy systems they saw on YouTube. I used to think that too until I actually started testing what lasts. And here is the uncomfortable truth most gardening channels want. Tell you up front. The fastest way to burn out is chasing annual vegetables that demand constant replanting, constant inputs, and constant trips back to the store. If you've ever planted tomatoes, lettuce, or peppers and wondered why you're still buying produce 6 months later, this video is for you. Because once you understand which plants are designed to feed you year after year with almost no effort, you stop gardening like a consumer and start growing like an owner. This isn't one of those recycled top 10 vegetables lists copied from seed catalogs or USDA pamphlets. I'm not here to sell you hype crops or pretend every plant is magical. Everything I'm about to share comes from years of trial, error, talking to growers who actually rely on their land, and watching what survives neglect, weather swings, and real life. Some of these plants are old ancient, even. Some are ignored because they don't fit industrial farming. And some are quietly feeding families while the rest of the world keeps lining up at grocery stores every week. Here is the core idea you need to understand before we get into the plants themselves. Annual vegetables are a subscription model. You pay every year with money, time, fertilizer, and stress. Perennial and self-renewing plants, on the other hand, are assets. You plant them once, establish them properly, and they pay you back for years, sometimes decades. That difference alone changes how you think about food. And yes, before anyone jumps in, I know the argument. You can't live on perennials alone, that's true. But you also can't build real food security on lettuce and Instagram gardens. The smartest growers, especially the ones who don't talk much online, build their system around long-term producers first, then layer annuals on top. That's the framework we're using here. Let's start with one of the most criminally misunderstood food plants in America. Asparagus. Most people see asparagus as a fancy side dish that costs too much at the store and takes too long to grow. And that mindset is exactly why it's one of the best food security plants you can own. Asparagus is not a vegetable you plant for instant gratification. It's a long-game plant, and once it's established, it becomes one of the most reliable spring food sources you'll ever have. Here's what most guides don't emphasize enough. A properly planted asparagus bed can produce for 20 to 30 years, not 3, not 5 decades. You plant crowns once. Give them decent soil and patience for the first couple of seasons, and after that, they come back stronger every single spring with almost zero effort. No replanting, no seed starting trays. No scrambling when the weather changes. From a nutritional standpoint, asparagus is dense fiber, folate, potassium, and it shows up early in the season when grocery prices are high and gardens are empty. That timing matters. When you're thinking in terms of food security, when a plant produces is just as important as how much it produces. Now here's the part nobody likes to hear. Most people fail with asparagus because they rush it. They harvest too early, weaken the plant, then complain it doesn't work. The growers who succeed treat the first 2 years as an investment phase. Let the plant build roots. Let it go wild. Then, once it's mature, you harvest lightly at first and increase over time. Do that right, and asparagus becomes one of the lowest maintenance calorie contributors in your garden. And if you're wondering why industrial agriculture doesn't push asparagus harder, it's simple. It doesn't fit fast turnover models. It ties up land for decades. That's great for families. Terrible for short-term profit cycles. Quick question for you. Have you ever planted something that took patience but paid you back more than anything else you've grown? Drop it in the comments. That's the kind of experience people actually learn from. Rhubarb is one of those plants that makes people nervous because it doesn't fit neatly into modern food categories. Is it a fruit? A vegetable? Is it toxic? And that confusion has pushed it out of most home gardens, even though it's one of the toughest, longest-living food plants you can grow in much of the US. Let's clear something up right away. Only the leaves are toxic. The stalks are not only safe, they're incredibly useful. This myth alone has probably stopped more people from planting rhubarb than any real downside. Once established, rhubarb is almost unkillable. Cold? Fine. Neglect? Fine. Poor soil? Not ideal, but it'll survive. And like asparagus, rhubarb comes back year after year, often producing more stalks than most families know what to do with. I've seen single plants feed households and neighbors alike. Nutritionally, rhubarb shines in ways most people ignore. It's high in fiber, vitamin K, and antioxidants. And because of its strong flavor, a little goes a long way. That matters when you're thinking about stretching food value, not just calories. Here's an insider tip. Rhubarb thrives when most gardens are still waking up. Early spring harvests reduce pressure on your food system when you're most vulnerable. That's not an accident. Plants like this evolved long before grocery stores existed. Why don't you see rhubarb everywhere anymore? Because it doesn't ship well, doesn't look flashy, and doesn't fit monoculture farming. But those same weaknesses make it perfect for home food security. If you've ever dismissed rhubarb as outdated or irrelevant, you're not alone. Most people did. And that's exactly why it deserves a spot in a serious garden. Sorrel is one of those plants that makes experienced growers smile and beginners scratch their heads. It's rarely mentioned in mainstream gardening content, but once you grow it, you realize how absurd that omission is. Sorrel is a perennial leafy green that comes back early, grows fast, and tolerates repeated harvesting without complaint. While most greens bolt, wilt, or demand perfect timing, sorrel just keeps producing. Cut it back, and it returns. Ignore it for a week, and it's still fine. The flavor is what surprises people, a lemony tang that turns simple meals into something interesting. But beyond taste, sorrel's real value is reliability. In cooler climates, it's one of the first edible greens of the year. In warmer regions, it can be managed with partial shade and still outperform many annual greens. From a nutrition perspective, sorrel provides vitamin C, iron, and minerals at a time when fresh greens are scarce. That alone makes it valuable. But here's the deeper insight. Sorrel reduces dependency. When lettuce prices spike or supply chains hiccup, sorrel doesn't care. Now, a quick reality check. Sorrel contains oxalic acid, which means moderation matters just like spinach. But no one panics about spinach. Context matters, and fear without nuance is how good plants disappear from culture. Let me ask you this. How many edible plants do you think we stopped growing not because they were bad, but because they didn't fit industrial systems? Think about that. At this point, you might be noticing a pattern. These plants aren't trendy. They're not hyped. They don't promise overnight results. And that's exactly why they work. Before we move on, I'll say this. All the plants I mentioned in this video, asparagus, rhubarb, sorrel, and the ones coming next are linked in the description if you want to research varieties or sourcing. Use whatever works for you. The goal here isn't to buy more stuff. It's to buy once and stop buying forever. One of the biggest lies people absorb about food growing is that it has to be fragile. That if you miss a watering, skip a week, or don't baby your plants, the whole system collapses. That idea didn't come from nature, it came from industrial farming and content designed to sell inputs. When you step outside that mindset, you start noticing a different class of plants. Ones that survive neglect, bounce back after abuse, and keep producing even when conditions aren't ideal. That's where we're headed now. Jerusalem artichoke, sunchoke. If there were a hall of fame for ignored survival crops in America, Jerusalem artichoke would be at the top. And the irony is wild, because this plant is native, absurdly productive, and almost impossible to eliminate once established. Jerusalem artichokes aren't artichokes at all, they're a sunflower relative that produces underground tubers. And once you plant them, you don't manage them so much as contain them. They come back every year, they multiply. And they do it without fertilizer, pampering, or precision. From a calorie standpoint, this is where things get serious. Unlike leafy greens, sunchokes actually contribute meaningful energy. They're rich in inulin, a prebiotic fiber that supports gut health and feeds beneficial bacteria. That is something you don't hear much about because it doesn't market well, but long-term digestion matters when you relying on your own food. Now let's talk honestly about the downside, because pretending it doesn't exist is how people lose trust. Some people experience gas or bloating when they eat too many sunchokes, especially at first. That's not a flaw, it's a dosage and adaptation issue. Start slow, cook them properly, your gut adjusts. The real reason you don't see Jerusalem artichokes everywhere isn't digestion. It's control. They don't fit monoculture farming, they spread. They don't respect neat rows or harvest schedules, but for a home grower, that problem becomes resilience. If you want a plant that laughs at drought, poor soil, and neglect and still feeds you, this is it. Perennial kale. Most people think of kale as something you replant every year, battle pests with, and eventually give up on. That's because they've only met the annual versions. Perennial kale is a different animal entirely. Once established, perennial kale becomes more shrub than vegetable. It doesn't bolt the same way annual kale does, it handles cold better. And it allows repeated harvesting, without the constant reset cycle. In mild climates, it produces year-round. In colder regions, it rebounds early and strong. The key advantage here isn't just yield, it's effort. Perennial kale reduces seed starting, transplanting, and timing stress. You walk out, harvest what you need, and walk back in. That's it. Nutritionally, it delivers exactly what you'd expect: calcium, vitamin K, antioxidants, and fiber. But the real value is reliability. This is the kind of plant you forget about until you need it, and it's still there. And here's something most guides gloss over: perennial kale thrives when you stop treating it like a delicate salad green. Give it space. Let it grow woody. Prune instead of replanting, think in years, not weeks. If you've ever felt burned out by brassicas, this one changes the relationship completely. Good King Henry. This plant almost never shows up in modern gardening videos, which tells you everything you need to know about how broken our food culture has become. Good King Henry was once a staple in European food gardens. Then spinach showed up, monoculture took over, and it quietly vanished. That's a mistake. Good King Henry is a perennial green that produces edible shoots, leaves, and even seeds. Think of it as a multi-use plant that fills the gap between spinach, asparagus, and wild greens. It's hardy, cold-tolerant, and once established, deeply reliable. Yes, it contains oxalates like spinach. And just like spinach, that's only an issue if you ignore moderation and preparation. What matters is that it produces when others fail. Early spring, late fall, marginal conditions, Good King Henry doesn't care. Why was it replaced? Because it doesn't ship well, it doesn't look uniform, and it doesn't fit industrial timelines. But for home food security, those weaknesses are strengths. Here's a question worth asking. How many plants disappeared not because they were inferior, but because they were too independent? Multiplier onions. This is where we start directly replacing grocery trips. Multiplier onions, also called walking onions or potato onions, don't behave like standard onions. You plant them once, and instead of forming a single bulb, they divide and multiply underground or produce top sets you can replant. That means no seed packets every year, no perfect timing, no starting over. Once established, you can harvest onions, replant a portion, and increase your stock automatically. That's a closed-loop system. And it's one of the simplest ways to stop buying onions altogether. Flavor-wise, they're excellent. Storage-wise, they're solid. And from a resilience standpoint, they're miles ahead of seed-grown onions that fail if conditions aren't perfect. This is one of those plants that makes you realize how artificial the modern gardening model is. Nature already solved the problem. We just stopped paying attention. If you've ever lost an onion crop and thought, why do I even bother? This is your answer. At this point, you might be realizing something important. None of these plants are rare because they don't work. They're rare because they don't make money for systems built on repeat purchases. Quick check-in. Which one of these surprised you the most so far? Sunchokes? Perennial kale? Multiplier onions? Drop it in the comments. Those answers help other viewers cut through the noise. There is a moment every experienced grower hits where they realize the real enemy isn't pests, weather, or even soil quality. It's replanting fatigue. Starting seeds, timing transplants, and racing seasons year after year burns people out. The smartest food systems quietly remove that burden. That's where self-renewing plants come in. These are plants that drop seed, spread gently, or return without being asked. When handled correctly, they don't become invasive chaos, they become a living pantry that shows up when you need it. Lovage is one of those plants that instantly reveals who actually cooked with their own food and who hasn't. Because once you grow it, you realize you don't need to buy celery again. Lovage tastes like celery, stronger, richer, and more complex. And unlike celery, which is notoriously fussy, lovage is a perennial that grows like a weed in the best possible way. It comes back early, grows tall, and provides leaves, stems, and seeds you can use for years. From a food security standpoint, lovage replaces an entire category of store-bought produce. Stocks, soups, stews, seasoning blends, it does it all. And it does it without constant watering or perfect soil. Here's the key insight most people miss. Lovage wants to reseed. If you let a few plants go to seed, you'll never need to plant it again. Thin where needed. Share where it spreads. That's management, not maintenance. Why isn't lovage everywhere? Because it doesn't look like grocery celery. That's it. Function lost to aesthetics. French sorrel. Self-seeding varieties. Earlier we talked about sorrel as a perennial, but certain French sorrel varieties take it a step further by quietly reseeding themselves. That means even if an older plant declines, replacements are already on the way. This matters more than people realize. A self-renewing green gives you insurance. Miss a season? Get busy? Nature covers the gap. The trick is restraint. Don't over-harvest every plant. Let a few mature fully. Once you understand that balance, sorrel becomes one of the most dependable greens in your system. This is also where gardening stops being rigid and starts becoming intuitive. You observe. You adjust. You stop forcing outcomes. Lamb's quarters. Now we're stepping into territory that makes some people uncomfortable because this plant has been labeled a weed. Lamb's quarters is one of the most nutritious leafy greens you can grow, and it often grows without permission. It's higher in protein than spinach, loaded with minerals, and shows up early and aggressively. The tragedy is that most people pull it out. Experienced growers don't. They thin it. They harvest it young. And they let it reseed lightly so it comes back next year. Lamb's quarters is proof that food security doesn't always look cultivated. Sometimes it looks wild, messy, and unplanned. But it works. And here is a quiet truth. Many of the most resilient food plants were rebranded as weeds because they interfered with monoculture crops. That wasn't accidental. Perennial herbs that function as food. This is where a lot of people underestimate value. Perennial herbs like sage, oregano, thyme, and rosemary don't just add flavor, they stretch calories. When food is simple, herbs turn basics into meals you actually want to eat. These plants live for years, some live for decades. And once established, they require almost nothing. From a preparedness perspective, herbs reduce dependency on packaged seasonings and imported flavor. From a daily life perspective, they just make everything better. And yes, many of them reseed naturally if allowed, especially oregano. Anyone who's grown it knows you don't really plant oregano. You invite it, and it decides where it lives. Let me pause here and say this clearly. Food security isn't just about survival calories. It's about sustainability, physically and psychologically. If your system tastes bad, you won't stick with it. That's why these plants matter. Malabar spinach. In warmer regions. For southern and warmer US climates, Malabar spinach is a game changer. It thrives in heat when regular spinach collapses. It self-seeds, and it grows vertically, saving space. Is it exactly like spinach? No, and that's fine. It fills the same role reliably. The biggest mistake people make with Malabar spinach is expecting it to behave like grocery greens. Once you stop doing that, it becomes one of the most dependable summer producers you can grow. At this stage, you're probably noticing something else. None of these plants require constant inputs. No weekly feeding schedules, no obsessive monitoring. They work because they align with natural systems, not because they fight them. And this is where the myth-busting comes in. The USDA and commercial agriculture focus on yield per acre per season. Home food security cares about yield over time. Those are two completely different metrics. And when you switch which one you prioritize, your plant choices change overnight. If you've ever felt like gardening advice didn't match real life, this is why. Before we move on, let me ask you, have you ever harvested food you didn't to plant something that just showed up? That's not luck. That's a system trying to work. Up to this point, we've talked about plants that show up early, come back on their own, or quietly replace grocery categories. But no real food security conversation is complete without addressing the question people are usually afraid to ask out loud. Where do the calories come from? You don't need to grow everything. But you do need a few plants that deliver energy reliably, year after year, without demanding your full attention. These are the backbone plants, the ones that make the system stable. Potatoes, grown as a self-renewing system. Yes, potatoes are technically annuals, but grown correctly, they behave like a perennial system. This distinction matters. Most people treat potatoes as a one-and-done crop. Plant, harvest, clear the bed, start over. That's the industrial mindset again. Traditional growers didn't do that. They saved seed potatoes, they allowed small tubers to remain. They let volunteers return. Once you shift to that model, potatoes become a semi-permanent calorie source. They're dense, adaptable, and incredibly efficient per square foot. And unlike many staples, they store well without technology. The real mistake people make with potatoes isn't growing them, it's overcomplicating them. Fancy containers, expensive soil mixes, constant intervention. Potatoes don't need that. They need loose soil, decent drainage, and to be left alone. And if you've never eaten a potato pulled from the ground and cooked the same day, you're missing a completely different food. Sweet potatoes, in suitable regions. Sweet potatoes deserve their own category because they do double duty. They provide calories and edible greens. Once established, sweet potatoes sprawl, shade soil, suppress weeds, and produce vines you can propagate endlessly. In warmer parts of the US, they're one of the most reliable calorie crops available. The leaves are edible. The tubers store well, and the plant itself improves soil over time. From a food security standpoint, this is exactly what you want. One plant, multiple outputs, low input. Why aren't sweet potatoes framed this way more often? Because grocery culture separates greens from roots. Nature doesn't. Beans, perennial or self-seeding varieties. Beans don't get enough respect in modern gardening because they're not flashy. But historically, they've been foundational. Certain perennial beans and self-seeding varieties can return year after year with minimal effort. And even annual beans, when allowed to reseed, dramatically reduce work. Beans bring protein into the system. They fix nitrogen. And they pair naturally with calorie crops like potatoes and corn. The key here isn't perfection, it's continuity. Let some pods dry. Let some seeds fall. Stop clearing everything in the fall. Gardens don't have to be clean to be productive. Fruiting perennials that act like vegetables. This is where the lines blur in a good way. Plants like berry bush, figs, and grapes often get categorized separately from vegetables, but from a food security perspective, they're heavy hitters. They produce reliably, store well, fresh, dried, or preserved, and require far less work over time than annual crops. Once established, these plants are about pruning, not planting. And that's a trade you want to make. The USDA doesn't emphasize these in self-sufficiency discussions because they take time to mature. But time is only a disadvantage if you never start. The system that makes this all work, here's the truth most videos never get to. Food security isn't about growing everything yourself. It's about reducing dependence intelligently. You don't need 100 plants. You need the right 10 to 15 working together. Perennials form the foundation. Self-seeders fill gaps. Calorie crops anchor the system. Herbs make it enjoyable. Annuals become optional, not mandatory. Once you build that base, grocery stores stop being a lifeline and start being a supplement. And this is where the myth-busting really matters. Monoculture farming optimizes for shipping, uniformity, and short-term yield. Home food systems optimize for resilience, diversity, and long-term output. Those goals are incompatible. That's why the advice often feels wrong. It's not designed for you. Let me leave you with a final expert insight, one I learned the hard way. The biggest mistake people make isn't choosing the wrong plants. It's trying to manage their garden like a project instead of a relationship. The moment you stop fighting nature and start observing it, the work drops and the returns increase. If this video helped shift how you think about food, do the obvious things like the video. Subscribe if you want more real-world growing insight, and check out the related resources linked in the description. And remember this, it's not about planting more. It's about planting once and letting time do the rest. If you want to go deeper, the next video breaks down how to design a small space version of this system, even if all you have is a backyard or a few raised beds. I'll see you there.